Well, I'd like to welcome everyone to another BYU Library Family History Center presentation, Untangling a Mess on the FamilySearch Family Tree. This is kind of a basic question. And as I got into doing this particular presentation, I realized that I would probably be presenting the most complicated presentation that I've done in a long time. It's complicated. There are lots of different ways of talking about complication. You have complication by numbers. In other words, the more people you're dealing with, the more complicated it is, or the more things you're dealing with, that's more complicated. You have complicated by concepts, and you have duplication by just things that don't work together. In other words, undoing the effects of a hurricane in Florida is complicated. What you're doing is fairly simple, and that is cleaning up. But that doesn't cut down on the complication. And I think that's the good analogy for what we're talking about here. And I really have to emphasize this. The messes on the FamilySearch.org family tree are not advertising their presence. They're hidden under a veneer of reliability because they're there, and some of them have sources and things like that. There's kind of the impression, if you aren't digging into things and looking and analyzing, that you're going to just say, oh, this is something I don't really want to get into that. It's all done and it's all right. And, I can't tell the difference. Well, that's really the problem. The problem is that a lot of these areas on the family tree that I could address, and I just picked one that's kind of my favorite one to go to, is it's really hidden. It's hidden where you have to really sit down and look at it and analyze it, and then all of a sudden you go, oh, wait a minute, that doesn't sound right. And so then you can get into it. And once you do, you find out that it's like tipping over a row of dominoes on the floor that's just going to go click, 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 click. And that's what it becomes. I also want to, it has to be you need to be able to understand what my position is on this. And my basics assumption is that I'm doing my ancestors. Okay, so I'm not really interested in doing a lot of people back in the ancient times who are not directly related to me. And if there is some relationship that can be shown, and there's adequate research that could be done and records that could be found, then I'm fine. I don't care. But on the other hand, I'm not into copying old pedigrees because my family tradition or somebody else has copied something back that connects you with a long line that goes back in Europe or someplace else in the world. And that doesn't mean that there aren't valid genealogies that go back in great distances. Those Chinese have, and the Oriental culture have produced genealogies that are reliable in the sense that they've been done very carefully back hundreds and hundreds of years, even 1,000 years or more. And some of those are available. But that is not the case in Europe. And that is not the case in most of the countries that form the basis for the immigrant population in the United States. So we're basically going to be focusing on the first level of what I call the mess. And another problem, another little challenge that, of course, many of us are very acutely aware of, is that parts of the family tree are overly active. And that generally increases as you go back in time. It's unusual to have, and very unusual, I'm going to say, to have the first 4 generations of your genealogy changing constantly by somebody who disagrees with your genealogy. If there is that, then I highly recommend that you contact the person if you can and resolve it and find out what the basis is. And that may take some time and it may take some effort. But as you go back in time on the family tree, you're exponentially increasing the number of people involved. And that means the number of changes and differences of opinion also will change, and the levels of competency and everything else. So I just chose this area on my family tree as being an active area. That means that there are people posting and changing and doing and adding information to this part of my family tree on a regular basis. Now I'm going to show you how far back we're going to get. I'm going to go back a ways because I want to show a real mess rather than just show something that's sort of halfway mess. Okay, so now we're back to the area on that particular line that I focused on for this particular. Now, another thing I can say is that if I do the same thing that I do today on this presentation, I can probably go back. If you have any number of things like this going back on your part of the FamilySearch Family Tree, then I can probably get into that area and find some of the same issues. So this is not something that's unique. This is something that's pretty endemic across the whole board on the FamilySearch Family Tree. And the nature of that reason is obvious. It's because it's an open, cooperative, wiki-based product, and it gives people an opportunity to add and change. So that has been the case since the very beginning, and it's possible, I suppose, that if we speculate into the future, that FamilySearch will come up with some kinds of helps to alleviate at least part of that issue. And that's probably going to happen when we get a high level of artificial intelligence involved in the family tree. And I can make a point here, and that is that this, as I said earlier, there's a veneer of respectability here. That's a light covering of respectability. And this is that if you look at this superficially, it looks like any other part of the family tree. There you are, you have names, you have dates, you apparently have a variety of different things. There's a few red marks out there. They're not uncommon even on records that are very correct. And so what we're doing here is we're looking at these individuals that are involved in this particular set. And I'm not going to go back too far because there's a obvious reason why that's not necessary. So I only use this as an example. And I want to start out by telling you, before I use it as an example, I don't believe that I'm related to any of the people shown in this screenshot. But they all appear on my family line. Now, the fundamental question that's asked almost immediately by anyone that knows what they're working on the family tree is, why am I letting this sit there? Well, that's kind of a complicated answer. The first question, the complicated answer is that I have not yet done the research on the people that I would necessarily have to do research on in order to cut all this off. In other words, just float it off into the space of the unconnected stuff on FamilySearch until somebody else connects it. But on the other hand, it's a very good example of messes, and it would make it harder for me to find some of the really, 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 really bad examples of things. So on any family tree, the ancestral line ends. This is it. This is the rule. And it's a fundamental. It's not something like the rules I've used in the past many, many times. This is just the way it works, and the way it works in all genealogy, and the way it works, how genealogy, the foundation of genealogy. So it's that when there is no supporting source, historical source that has some validity, documenting a parent-child relationship, that family line ends. So in this example, if we find that John Morgan does not have any record showing who his parents were, and William Morgan, number 2, Roman numeral 2, does not have any records that show that he is the father of this John Morgan, not a John Morgan in some other place, but this John Morgan, then this line ends. Anything beyond John Morgan is fantasy, imagination. It's just not there. There's nothing that you can rely on. And it doesn't matter what everybody thinks. It doesn't matter how many sources they have or anything else. The number of sources are material, because if they're missing the parent-child relationship source, the rest of them are just more sources about that individual and that individual's family. Okay, so if we start with John Morgan, this is the 1609, 1699 person, we may find that his parents are incorrect. And therefore, there will be no need for me to work on any of the remaining ancestors shown in the family tree. So focusing on this John Morgan is why I chose it, by the way. I will not necessarily have any need to go on and do research on William Morgan II. Perhaps. Okay, so the question is, could there be a record on William Morgan II that showed that he had a son, this son, who was born in 1609 and died in 1699? Yes, he could, but that's going to be something that's just sort of there superficially. Am I required to keep doing that, going back? The only reason I would do that is if I found that there was a valid basis for showing that this John Morgan was actually a child of William Morgan II, or well, I'm going to call him William Morgan, 1582, 1629. So that's the kind of reasoning whether I would go ahead and so let's start with John Morgan and see what the entries tell him about him and his family. Okay, so we're looking here at the card from the pedigree card in the landscape view of John Morgan and Elizabeth Jones. And they are supposedly married about 1640 in Maryland, British colonial America. Question here is, was Maryland even a colony in 1640? Was there any settlements there? I mean, 1640 is only 20 years after the Pilgrims got here in 1620 in Massachusetts Bay Colony. So the question is, did Roger Williams make it over to Maryland by 1640? That's probably one of the first historical questions I would be asking in this case. The answer is that there's an about here, and so the about tells me that we don't know the number anyway, and so we're going to have to do a little bit more research before we do it. Now, the question here is, when do we start doing the research? And my answer is, you really need to look at what's here and make sure you understand why and how all the sources may relate, because this question about his marriage may be resolved. There may actually be a marriage record attached, and so you really do. But from my standpoint, in the way that I conduct genealogical research, is I'm going to look for the places first. That's just an automatic reaction. Anytime I look at something that somebody says, I ask the same two questions: what time are we talking about, and where are we talking about? Because the place and the time are going to determine a lot of historical issues with whether or not records are available, but are also going to tell us where we're going to start to look for records and which time period. And if I find that a place did not exist at the time that an event was supposed to have occurred, then that just means we don't have any idea where that person was, where that event occurred in that person's life. And so that event is a non-event until we get some information for it. So this person is listed as my 9th great-grandfather, going back on the FamilySearch Family Tree. And if I seem to be a little bit repetitious, it's because I'm going to be repetitious. And that is, I'm going to be asking the same questions over and over and over again until they are resolved in a way that says, okay, so this is no longer an issue because I know that this person isn't the same person as this other person, or I know that this person existed because I have a certain number of records that give me some basis for my belief and or whatever. So this is going to be something you keep asking until you come to the resolution. So the question I have is to reformat it in like a research goal here to determine whether John Morgan with that ID number on Family Search is the son of William Morgan II with that ID number on Family Search. That's another kind of shorthand way of referring to people on the Family Search family tree. And I'm going to have to summarize a lot of the steps. This is not going to be, this is 1 hour presentation, and I don't have time to go into all the information that I would be looking at and all the work that I would do. One thing that I would do is I would look at every single one of the sources and try and determine if there was any information in the sources about this particular person, assuming that he existed at all. And I'm going to mention again that it's possible that he's not my relative. In other words, if I determine by looking at him and then dropping down one generation closer in time as children, for example, and I determine that there's no support for the fact that he was the father of the next person down, then he goes away and everybody else that's attached to him goes away. And so that, in a sense, is a way of doing it. And if you want to look at it, it's like you go into the garden and you find a bunch of weeds and you pull them out. I mean, that isn't even there's no moral issues involved in pulling weeds out of a garden. And there's no real issue when you cut off a line that is not related to you. If I really can't, because of the way of the structure of genealogical records, can't really justify just supposing that this person might be a possible relative if I did enough research. So remember, we need to have a valid historical record that shows that relationship. So there's no connection without that particular record. So let's look at John Morgan here. We've got 2 dates for his birth, and he was born in Llandaff, Glamorgan in Wales. That's interesting. Morgan is probably, and I'll mention this again, but Morgan is like Jones and like Brown and like other Smith and other names that everybody has that name. It's just a tremendously common name in Wales. So John is also one of the most common surnames in the world, of English world. And so you're really going to have to work hard in this case to make sure that you haven't just picked up some John Morgan that happened to be floating by as you were doing research. So here we have a date in Llandaff of 1609 for a birth. Now, here's the question that comes up just immediately, is where did they get a birth record? This is not the earliest time for birth records, but it's getting into records that are probably not available in 1609 in Wales. Birth records, christening records, yes. Baptism records in the church are probably records. 1609 is long before any kind of civil registration or any other kind of record like that. So you're going to have to look at probate records. You're going to have to look at a lot of different things that may have existed back in 1609 in Wales to come up with that birth record. So the question is the 12 sources up there that are supposedly attached to John Morgan, or they are attached, but are supposedly John Morgan, then does any of them show that where they got a record for a birth in 1609 in Wales? And then the death record here is 1629. So first of all, we have the issue of the person being born in Wales with the time. And the reason why we're doing this is because this person is supposed to live in the colonies, the American colonies. English colonies. And so you can see his death is supposed to have happened in Brunswick, Virginia, British colonial America. And 1699, interestingly enough, he died in that British colony, and that he was married in Maryland. So this person has traveled across the ocean from Wales sometime in his life. He's ended up in Virginia where he's going to die, but somehow or another he picks up a marriage in Maryland, and he has 3 children. Okay, we'll get to some of this, I'm sure. So he's married in Maryland, but the other thing we need to note is he was 90 years old when he died. That makes him tremendously unusual in 1699, when the average death date for males in the colonies was probably in the, I'm just guessing right now because it may be different, but it's really low. It's something like 50 years or younger, like 35 or 40 years old was the average death. And to live to be 90 years old is extremely, extremely unusual. And guess what? He had 3 wives. That's, of course, you don't get that on unless you go on to the detail page and scroll down and see what he did. His first wife, he married Elizabeth Jones in 1640 in Maryland. And she was born in England in 1611, which kind of close to his birthday. And she died in New Haven, Connecticut. Okay. Here's we go. So supposedly John Morgan was still alive when his wife died, although he was almost 90 years old. And somehow he died in Virginia. But somehow, when you look at it, she died in New Haven, Connecticut. Now, are we going to say there was a divorce? Well, there weren't divorces back then. You're just going to wipe that idea out of your head. They didn't get a divorce. This is getting to be too many different places for things to happen to be reasonable or even believable. And to this point, if you were doing this, you would fairly conclude that we weren't talking about the same 2 people. We weren't talking about a person who named Elizabeth Jones, who died in New Haven, Connecticut, married to John Morgan, who was the person from Wales who ended up in Virginia. Okay, so that's the difference. But this makes it interesting. In 1640, he also married Marjorie Snyder in Wales. Okay, so he had to make quite a trip to get from Wales to America. The trip across the Atlantic in that early 1600s could take anywhere from longer than 3 months, 2 to 3 months. And he would have had to have gone back. Maybe he started out in Wales and married this lady in Wales. And then the question is, did she die in Wales? And unfortunately, we don't know when she died. We know when she died, this Marjorie Snyder, but we don't know where she died or when she died because there's a deceased. So they say that, but she was married on the 6th of August in 1640, and sometime before the end of the year, this guy had jumped on a boat and made it, and somehow had gotten rid of the marriage there. Maybe she died like within a month later, which is possible. He jumps on a boat, he races over to Maryland and marries the other wife, and then they end up in where? Well, she ends up in New Haven, Connecticut. He ends up in Virginia. Okay. And this sounds just sort of, well, could that happen? The answer is we get back to a very interesting story that I heard from in the Maryland State House, which at one time was the capital of the United States of America. And they were in the conventions, and Thomas Jefferson was down at his home in Monticello and needed to get up to Annapolis. where the state house is located in Maryland. Well, he began the journey, and it took him the distance. You can look it up. It's not that great of a distance. It took him 2 weeks to travel from his house to Maryland because the road conditions were so terrible and there was so much muddy road that he barely could move from through the land. So this wasn't something that somebody could just, get in their car and drive down and stop off and get a hamburger on the way. This was something that was a major expedition kind of thing every time that you got in your wagon and were going to go any kind of distance. And when you're talking about going from New Haven, Connecticut to Virginia, that is a much further distance than Thomas Jefferson and his efforts. John also married Elizabeth Dunford, but there are no dates or places for this person on the family tree. Well, I have to admit that when I went back yesterday to look at the information that I'd done for this presentation, because I do them a little bit earlier than that, somebody had already taken off these 2 marriages, so they vanished off. So I would have done that if I had not used this for an example. By the way, none of these wives had any attached sources. So we don't know that she was born in England in 1611, and we don't know that she died in New Haven, Connecticut in 1690. We have no record that shows that. So if you think in terms of records, when you're thinking of doing research in anything, not just research in genealogy, but if you start thinking in terms of doing research, period, then the concept of research is that you have to find historic support for whatever it is you're doing, whatever it is you're recording. It is not unusual in most supported research, like when I do that, is to have a source for almost every paragraph and every sentence that you come up with, or having it for every date and every name. That's everything that you in place. It's just part of the process. And if you don't follow that process, then you end up with things like this that we're talking about. Okay. Because there's no source for any of the 3 wives. So here's my rule. I kind of restate kind of you understand. I don't have a definite rule that says that Elizabeth Jones was not married to John Morgan. But basically, until I get to do the research and either find that there's another wife and another time, or find that Elizabeth Jones in Connecticut could not possibly have been married to John Morgan, I'm not going to take it off the family tree. I'm not making any changes until I have a source that supports that, what I'm doing. And the reason I'm doing this analysis, and the reason for the analysis, is that if I do this analysis, it gives me an idea of where I need to start. And in this case, as I've mentioned, if I find this person isn't connected, I can go to one of his children to see if they're connected, and so forth, until I find someone who may have no sources, which we'll probably receive, see here. And then when you have no sources, I don't have to worry about it. I can work there, and I can basically consider the rest of the people upline from that person to be imaginary. And so if that's where I would start my research, is with the person below that person that happens to be sourced and has information supporting their existence on the family tree. So let's go look back at this, at John Morgan again, and we'll see that there are 12 sources. So let's kind of see, what do the sources show? Do they make any sense? And I'm just going to kind of run through them so that you can see a little bit about the analysis here. So the first source supports the idea that there was a John Morgan who was born in Virginia in 1610. That is interesting. and that would require, it wouldn't require too much research, because there weren't all that many people in Virginia in 1610. So if there is a John Morgan who was born in Virginia in 1610, it's going to be pretty easy to figure that one out, because that's way too early. We're talking about Jamestown here. They would only have been in Virginia for about 5 years or so. It's possible, but basically that says we're talking about this person who was born in 1610 in Virginia. And remember that the you won't remember, and I don't want to quote it, but it differs from the information that we already have in the family tree. So this one really doesn't support anything that we have here. And he had a daughter who died in 1633 in Middlesex, England, and was baptized in September of 1633. There's this concept that somehow he was going back and forth across the ocean. There were very, very, very few people, and I mean, a smaller number than you can imagine, of people who had the wherewithal and the time in their lives and the resources to keep going back and forth to England until well into the 1700s, when the ships improved their being able to time they took to cross. I mean, literally going across one time to England would take most of a year in your life, if you could if you got boats that were going, and if you could be a passenger, and if you had the money to buy a ticket or some connection to get on the ship. Another third source, a John Morgan who arrived by 1638 in Virginia, who was an indentured servant. Oh, now if we have an indentured servant, we have a whole nother problem, because indentured servants were people who were usually between the ages of around 16 up to 30, and they were people who were, in a sense, gathered off the streets and have no real ancestry. And they were illiterate, and the vast majority of them were illiterate and probably did not know where they had been born in England. So if he arrived in 1638 in Virginia, then anything referencing as an indentured servant, anything referencing what his origins are or his kind of contact with England are, it'd be way, way, way off. By the way, if a daughter was baptized in 1633, what was he doing becoming an indentured servant in 1638? Okay, so there's lots of questions. Some Morgans mentioned in the Perkins County, North Carolina, and land transactions from the 1600s to 1700s. Like I said, Morgan's a very common name. It doesn't say anything about where they are. Now, when I mentioned earlier, and what I would end up doing is actually trying to find those sources and read the information and look at the information to see if that was true. So if there's a Morgan book in that county in North Carolina, then I would probably be trying to find that book. But that would throw the whole thing out, because if he was in North Carolina, he wasn't in Virginia, he wasn't in Connecticut, he wasn't in any place. So that's the problem there. Another John Morgan, who was born in Wales and came to Boston in 1636 and lived in Springfield, Virginia. Okay, maybe. We're going to have to look at that. A John Morgan who died in 1699 in Massachusetts. Oh, I don't think so. I don't think so. Massachusetts was a different colony back in the 1600s. You know, it's interesting. But this just gives us another place. It gives us Massachusetts on top of, it's the same as trying to say North Carolina. I mean, where was this guy when when we're connecting it from his descendants? Where were these people living? Well, I can fast forward through this. They actually lived in Kentucky, and they went into Indiana. And so, no, that's not correct. Okay, one more. John Morgan, who was born in 1607 and baptized in Bristol, England. And somebody had tried to delete it and they weren't successful. obviously this guy's way off the map. And if he was born in 1607 and died when he was in 1699, he was over 100 years old. Probably not likely. John Morgan in UK extracted probate records who died in Canterbury, England. Well, if he died in England, he's in England. And what did he have to do with the connection to the United States? So, or America. A book about the Morgans focusing on Miles Morgan, born in 1616. Okay, this is a descendancy book that goes back to a person named Miles Morgan and his descendants. As far as I've ever been able to determine up to now, I have not related to anybody that takes me back to a Miles Morgan. So the answer is probably not my person. A Wikipedia article about the Morgan family of banking fame. Okay, this is great. This comes into the mythological area of genealogy, that somehow the Morgan family that I'm related to was connected to the J.P. Morgan family, the banking family. My answer to that is my people never had a dollar to their name. They were extremely poor. And so that's not likely that they were the banking folks. A random John Morgan in Wales with a wife named Elizabeth. Then he didn't get married over here in Maryland. He must have gotten married in Wales. If he's an indentured servant, he wasn't married. And so all of these are starting to become very complicatedly contradictory. Another random John Morgan married Elizabeth Morgan Jones. So he married a Morgan, which is not impossible. But to find a person who was named Elizabeth Morgan Jones, she would have been married earlier to a Jones. So he married someone that was already married and had another husband. Okay, I give up. There's no way that this is one person. It looks like we really, the sources here are 12 different people named John Morgan. Or not even, some of them don't even mention the name John. But there's no way that any of these sources are valid. And so forth. There's none here. Okay, so that's the point. The point is I've now gone through the kind of the initial analysis of the locations and the dates and shown that some of the things that are there are not even physically possible. And then we go to the sources, and we so far have found absolutely nothing that would tell us who any of John Morgan's children were, as well as who his parents were. And we might be able to go back through these books and see, but consistently, they're not consistent. You would have to have chosen one or the other. You're going to either choose the John Morgan born in North Carolina, you're going to choose the one born that was in Virginia, or the one that had a wife that died in Connecticut, or the one who ended up coming from Wales. Or maybe just came from Wales and then the rest of it is not correct. And there are over 500,000 records on Find My Past for the people named John Morgan. So there's a lot to go through if you want to try to winnow it down to where you're going to be there. So now let's look at the children. My line comes through Edward Morgan, born in 1653, and has no death date. He's supposedly married to Mary Crane, and so we want to look and see what is. And this choice makes my life tremendously more simple because there are no attached records, sources, anything to Edward Morgan. So who was he? Where was he? And where did he come from? And if he's the only connection to, which he is, the only connection to John Morgan, and all that line behind John Morgan going up into the dim but dark past, then are we going to base our whole life looking at John Morgan and his progenitors, his ancestors, or are we just going to say, forget those people, we don't even have a way of knowing that they're related? And I would at this point be perfectly justified in cutting John Morgan and all his stuff off of my connection on the family tree. until someone came up with me or someone else came up with a record showing John Morgan's parents. That's the end of the story. Now, the question is, how much further down does this go? And by the way, there's no attached sources for Mary Crane either, the wife. So it's kind of out. So then I have a choice. I have a choice of whether or not to ignore the unsubstantiated line. In other words, I'm going to say, well, great. I don't believe any of this, like I said at the beginning. I don't really believe in any of it. But on the other hand, I don't have the time or the interest right now to work on that part of my family line because I suspect that I'm going to be spending a lot of time unproductively because over the last 100 years of my family having done work on this line, no one has managed to come up with even kind of one source or anything. So I would suggest that that's a choice you have to make. And sometimes it's in the way of a Hobson's choice, which means that you're not benefited if you do it and you're not benefited if you don't do it. And so you just have to kind of make a choice one way or the other. So I'm not saying that sometime in the future I might not come back and go over this again. And as I mentioned at the first, these people were all changing at that time. In other words, there's all sorts of people making changes, adding and taking people away and changing dates and all that kind of stuff. So it's very possible at some point in time, someone does the research and actually makes a change that's supported by a source. So I haven't seen that yet, but it would be nice if they did that, and nice if they understood that the line ends with Edward Morgan, who has no sources. It's interesting too to go on down from Edward Morgan, and really it was just kind of a time factor here and how I was going to handle this, whether I went down one more towards the present to Sergeant Major Richard Morgan, who, by the way, is Captain Richard Morgan and is not the person that's filled in here in the FamilySearch Family Tree as the fact that he's not married to Jane or Jean Cheverell, whoever she was. So this is just kind of the interesting things. And how are you going to detect this? In other words, how will you know if you're getting off into this? Well, the answer is fairly straightforward and, well, maybe not as simple as you'd wish it to be, but it is relatively simple. And that is, you look at each of the individual sources on each of the people on your family line going back. Now, if you're involved in genealogy at let's say a higher level, you're actually doing research, you're contributing valid things to the family tree, then you're already there. In other words, if you work back on your family line, you may already have reached the person who's the end of the line who has no more sources. And if you realize that unless you get some sources and show who the next person is, you can't just start filling in names and claiming relationship to royalty, which, by the way, if you go back on this line far enough, they're all royalty. Not royalty, nobility. They're not kings and queens. They're dukes and things like that. That's where somebody needed to connect back there. And if you want my opinion, they just started filling in names and that were in the right time until they could connect back to that royal line, because they knew that they were descended from that royal line because that was Morgan's and that was their name. And there was, not the fact that half the country, not really, but substantial part of the country of Wales is all named Morgan. So there we go. It's waiting for someone, me or someone else, to find support for an existing line or a new one. And there might be a little bit of politics. I don't know what you call politics, but not politics in the sense of that, but internal politics. And that is that there are some very nice people who have been doing a lot of genealogy on this and other of my lines who I don't want to upset. And if I were to start chopping up these lines, there would be people who were upset with me, not because they had any information to contradict what I was doing, but merely because I was cutting off their line, which they hadn't had for years and years and always known about. So that's another kind of consideration. And so the answer, very simple to say to how to do this, is you would start as you go back on your line. This is the simplest thing to do and how to get started in here. And I'm leaving it here on this choice because this is a choice that you make. So in order to find research opportunities on the FamilySearch Family Tree, you can start looking back on any one of your family lines. Of course, you have 2 parents and 4, 8, 16, 32, 64, assuming there's no step parents and there's no double marriages and people dying. But, the number is going to be even higher. But as you go back just a few generations, you have a lot of lines that you can start to work on. And basically, the idea is anytime when you're starting back, is you go through the same process. You start in the present. And I can always use this view to stay focused on the line I'm working on. So as I go back, I can always come back here and say, okay, now, I've forgotten how I'm related to this person. Click, show my relationship. Now, if all of a sudden it says you don't have a relationship, then you probably strayed off your research path. For instance, you would start with the first person, which is you, and you would say, oh, well, I know I was who my parents are. Well, in today's world, I would take a DNA test and see if it reinforces your belief of who your parents are. But there's lots and lots of stories out there now about people who find out they're not related to their parents. But assuming that's not a problem, then you could keep stepping back until finally you reach a person who has no sources, or the sources are like these. None of them have any information that's helpful in determining if this person is related to this other person as a parent-child relationship. So that's the step that I do. I've done that literally thousands of times with people. I go back on their line and I say, okay, well, this person has no sources, or this person, I don't find a source for a parent-child relationship. So that's where you start your research, is on that person, not back at some empty space on a chart that you say is somebody you want to look for. Because you may have jumped over all the people who are unsubstantiated and start research on somebody that's just out there. That's why my statement at the beginning about I prefer to do work on people I'm related to for a number of reasons. And one caution always is, beware that the relationship viewer shows what is in the family tree and makes no comment on actual relationships. Okay, so if you go a little step further, you'll go to apps like Relationship Finder or whatever, and you'll find an app that says 2 people in the same area, on your iPhones or your Android phones or whatever, are related, and here's how you're related. Well, that's fine if you can see the steps going back and know that everything's been verified on that. But if it goes back to some ancient person in the 1600s, I'm willing to make the assumption that that's just an imaginary relationship. So I'm saying that because John Morgan had no relationship source connected to him and no sources in the family tree. So then we go down to Edward. And that's what I just did. But I gave you a little preview and said he has no sources attached. So no sources. I might help to know that this link's been researched for over 100 years by my ancestors. 100 years of genealogists have not found Edward Morgan. And I had an attached note to Edward Morgan back in 2013, and I'll just say that I didn't find any source, and apparently someone put him in an attempt to show that we were related. The Edward Morgan, the Morgan line was related to Sarah Boone, who was Sarah Morgan Boone, and who married Squire Boone, who was the father of Daniel Boone. Daniel Boone's a kind of semi-famous character in American folklore, who's a real person. But no, we were not married to Sarah Boone. I took me back there in this time, earlier time, that took me about, let's say, 15, 20 minutes to show that I was not related to Sarah Boone. So do we know that Daniel Boone's mother was a Morgan? The answer is yes, we do, but I'm not related to Daniel Boone or his mother. Okay, so there's no sources for Edward. We should take the time to keep working down the line to see where it really ends. So we're going to have to see if Sergeant Major Richard Morgan has sources that show that he's the father of Jacob Morgan, that shows the father of Dr. John Morgan, who shows that he's the father of Gerard Morgan. And as I mentioned originally, it's interesting in the way that this was coming out because we have Richard Morgan born in British Columbia and in Frederick and dying in West Virginia in 1763. And that's interesting because 1763 was about 100 years before West Virginia became a state. Exactly. And Berkeley County was in 1772, and Shepherdtown was settled in 1730. And it was Shepherdtown was, and he doesn't have any sources either. None of these are even arguably sources: public member trees, ancestor family trees, the Sons of American Revolution, membership application, and Morgans in Virginia. I don't think so. Then there was an article here about Richard Morgan. He's the one of the line, and he served as a captain and so forth. So there's some out there, and he was actually the one that was in Shepherdtown, which was called Mecklenburg beforehand. So this gets into complicated stuff. I wasn't intending that everybody read all this or to make comment on it, but what I was saying is that if you want to go through it, we'll have the video uploaded. You can stop the video and look at this and understand the arguments here, why this person was not the one in Shepherdstown. And another one is born in Shepherdstown in 1700 in Shepherdstown, Berkeley, Virginia. So it's getting kind of vague here. This is where there has to be some research. There's not a matter of me just saying, I don't know if it's true or not. I really you have to really dig into it. And apparently back in 2013, I did, at least as far as the claim that we were related to Daniel Boone. So it's interesting that attached to Jacob Morgan, who was one in that line, he names his wife and 2 sons. And on the family tree are 2 wives and 14 children. So he died with 1 wife and 2 sons, and maybe a bunch of daughters, but they may not have been in the will, or any of us children who died before he died. But we now have 2 wives and 14 children. And this is a statement that says, you need to start at the present and work back. I work down for the example here, but I would normally work back from the line, up the line, meaning going back in time. And this is the last person really on this line that has any support for existence and no support for a parent is Gerard Morgan, my 4th great-grandfather, period. So from Gerard back, as far as I'm concerned, they're all made up. They don't exist. They don't have any supporting sources. There's nothing there. Thanks for watching.
Well, James, we have a number of questions in the chat, starting with Dave.
can you import stuff from Ancestry to correct it? The answer is yes, but you should be sure that the stuff on Ancestry is correct too. And it's a good idea to use Ancestry in doing all of this research because they generally have an additional number of records that they can be helpful. I'm going to say this, I start all my research in Ancestry when I'm doing research on the family tree. And then I augment what's on the family tree or correct what's on the family tree from the sources that I find. But then I find sources on FamilySearch also. And on Find My Past if I'm doing English research. But what if the supporting source is inaccurate? Historical sources always have that problem, and that's why we need to have multiple sources. We go beyond one source. If we have one source, we have no confidence in the fact that it's correct. We need to have substantiating sources that will show that that's correct.